It was a bright, sunny morning when Maria decided to do something that felt a little out of character, but deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. She had lived next to Mr. Thompson for several years, and while they were neighbors, they never really spoke. Maria had always been a kind-hearted person, someone who believed that the world could be made better with small acts of kindness. But Mr. Thompson, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, had never been kind to her. In fact, he had made a point of being cold and distant, always keeping to himself. Maria had heard him make some harsh comments in passing, remarks that made her feel uncomfortable, but she never retaliated. She believed in the power of understanding and compassion, and she always hoped that, one day, their relationship could improve. But as the months went by, nothing seemed to change. Mr. Thompson would nod in passing or sometimes mutter a greeting, but there was no warmth in his words, no friendliness. One morning, as Maria was standing by her kitchen window, she noticed Mr. Thompson outside. He was trimming the hedges in his yard, grumbling to himself. Maria had seen him like this many times before, grumpy, distant, and unapproachable. But that day, something shifted inside her. It wasn't the first time she had thought about doing something kind for him, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because, despite all the tension between them, she still couldn't help but feel empathy for him. After all, everyone has their own struggles, and she wondered if perhaps his gruff exterior was just a mask for something deeper. With a deep breath, she decided to act. She had just finished baking a fresh batch of cookies, her famous chocolate chip cookies, the ones that always seemed to make people smile. She thought about how a simple, unexpected gesture might change things. Maybe, just maybe, giving him these cookies would break the ice between them. It wouldn't hurt to try, right? As Maria packaged the cookies neatly in a small box, she felt a little nervous. What if he didn't like the gesture? What if he took it the wrong way? What if it made things awkward between them? But she pushed these thoughts aside. She had always believed in the power of kindness, and even if it didn't result in immediate change, at least she could feel good about doing something right. She carefully placed the box on her porch, took a deep breath, and walked across the yard to Mr. Thompson's house. The closer she got, the more her heart raced. She wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, even if it was a friendly one. But as she approached his front door, her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the doorbell. Her nerves were getting the best of her, but she couldn't back up now. The door creaked open, and there stood Mr. Thompson, looking surprised. Maria smiled as she held out the box of cookies, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I made these for you. I thought you might like them." He stared at her for a moment, eyes narrowing as if trying to process what was happening. Maria felt a wave of anxiety rush over her, but she didn't back down. She waited quietly, her hand still offering the box, silently hoping he would accept it. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His tone was neutral, but there was something about it that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to react. "Thank you," he said, before taking the box from her, albeit reluctantly. Maria smiled, nodding. "I hope you enjoy them," she said softly, before quickly turning to leave, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had taken the first step toward breaking down the walls that had separated them for so long. As she walked back to her house, Maria felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Would this small act of kindness make a difference? Would it change the way Mr. Thompson saw her? Only time would tell, but for now, she felt proud of herself. It wasn't easy, but she had done something she believed in. And sometimes, that's all you can do. Maria walked back to her house, feeling a strange mix of relief and nervous anticipation. She had done it. She had taken the first step. She couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Thompson would think after receiving her gift. Would he eat the cookies, or would he just leave them on the counter, untouched? She didn't know, but she hoped it might at least bring a smile to his face. As she entered her home, she busied herself with a few things around the house, trying to distract herself from the thought of what was happening next door. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment she had handed him the box. His hesitation, the way he stared at it for so long, made her wonder if she had made the right choice. But she had given him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe, just maybe, her gesture would help bridge the gap between them. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Maria worked around the house. She couldn't shake the image of Mr. Thompson's face when he received the cookies. Had he been genuinely surprised? Or was it more out of obligation? She couldn't tell. But she reminded herself that it didn't matter. She had done something kind. And that was all she could control. The rest was up to him. It was only 15 minutes later when Maria heard a knock on the door. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a neighbor stopping by or a package that had been delivered. But when she opened the door, her heart sank a little. Standing there were two police officers. They looked professional but stern, and they gave her a questioning glance as they spoke. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about an incident at your residence. We need to speak with you." Maria's mind raced. What could they possibly want? She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't even seen the officers around before. A complaint. She repeated, her voice shaky, but trying to remain calm. What kind of complaint? One of the officers spoke again, his voice polite but firm. "A neighbor reported that there was some aggressive behavior on your part. They claimed you were harassing them. We just need to sort this out." Maria's mind was spinning. Aggressive. Harassing. What on earth were they talking about? She had just given Mr. Thompson some cookies, for goodness sake. How could that be interpreted as anything other than a friendly gesture? Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Was there some misunderstanding? Had Mr. Thompson misunderstood her kindness? For a moment, she stood there, frozen. The officers were waiting for her to explain, but her thoughts were scattered, and she felt the walls of the situation closing in. How could something so innocent go so wrong? She had hoped that offering cookies would help break the ice, but instead, it seemed to have escalated things. As the officers stood there, patiently waiting for her to respond, Maria struggled to find her voice. I just gave him cookies," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought it would be a nice thing to do. I didn't mean any harm." The officers exchanged looks but didn't say anything for a moment. Maria felt the weight of their silence, the pressure of the misunderstanding hanging heavily in the air. It was as if her innocent gesture had somehow turned into something much bigger, something she hadn't expected at all. Her mind raced with questions. How could something so simple be turned into an accusation? Had Mr. Thompson really seen her kindness as aggression? Or was there something more going on that she didn't understand? As the seconds ticked by, Maria knew one thing for certain. She was going to have to explain herself, even if she didn't fully understand the situation. But no matter how much she wanted to argue, she stayed calm. There was no way to take back the awkwardness of the situation now. She just hoped the officers would understand, and that this wouldn't go any further. The officers stood there, silent for a moment, letting Maria's words hang in the air. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to understand what was happening. The whole situation felt surreal. Just a few minutes ago, she had been happily going about her day, confident in the kindness she had shown. Now she was standing face to face with two police officers, being accused of something she never imagined. "I didn't mean any harm," Maria repeated, hoping they would understand. She was starting to feel more and more confused. I thought it would be a nice gesture, the simple, friendly thing." The officers looked at each other, and the tension seemed to grow thicker. Finally, one of them spoke again, his voice softer this time. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. We were called here to clear up a situation. Your neighbor is concerned, and we need to make sure everything is okay." Maria's mind raced. Her neighbor concerned. She couldn't understand why Mr. Thompson would be upset. She had only given him a box of homemade cookies, not even a large gesture, just something small and simple. She hadn't expected a standing ovation or anything, but she also hadn't expected to be standing here, talking to the police. Did he say I was threatening him? Mariah asked, her voice growing steadier. She needed to know exactly what had been said. I gave him cookies, that's all. I thought it might make him feel more comfortable, you know, as neighbors. The officers exchanged another look, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. Maria's hands were shaking, but she clenched them into fists to keep her composure. She could tell they weren't exactly sure what to make of the situation either. They had been called in to investigate something that seemed out of place, and now they were stuck between trying to understand a simple misunderstanding and carrying out their duty. Finally, the other officer spoke, his tone now neutral. We're just relaying the information we received. Your neighbor was upset, that's all. They felt that your actions were. He paused, as if searching for the right word. Invasive. Invasive. Mariah felt her chest tighten as she tried to comprehend this new piece of information. Was he serious? How could giving someone cookies ever be considered invasive? Her mind flashed to the last few years of living in this neighborhood, always trying to keep things civil and friendly with everyone, even with Mr. Thompson, who rarely gave her the time of day. I'm just trying to be friendly, Mariah explained, her voice cracking a little. I thought, maybe if I did something kind, it might change things between us. I didn't think he would take it the wrong way. I don't know what to say. I never intended to upset him. The officers didn't immediately respond. They both stood there, still unsure of how to proceed. Mariah could sense that they were starting to realize that something wasn't quite right about this whole situation. Maybe it didn't add up to them either. As Maria stood there, trying to stay calm, she felt a mix of disbelief and frustration building up inside her. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but it was hard not to feel like she was being judged for something that wasn't even her fault. How had a simple act of kindness turned into this? How had it escalated to the point where the police were involved? She didn't want to argue with the officers, but it was clear that something had been lost in translation. Mr. Thompson had misunderstood her gesture entirely. And now, here she was, in the middle of an uncomfortable situation that she hadn't expected. She just hoped that somehow the truth would come out and everything would be okay. But for now, she was stuck, caught between the confusion of it all and the realization that things between her and her neighbor would never be quite the same again. The officers stood there for what felt like an eternity, their expressions serious as they took in Mariah's words. Mariah could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. It wasn't just the officer's quiet response that was unsettling, but the fact that she couldn't fully understand what had gone wrong. How could something so innocent be twisted into an accusation? She had hoped this conversation would be over quickly, but instead, it felt like the misunderstanding was growing larger by the minute. One of the officers stepped forward, his tone a little softer this time, but still cautious. "Ma'am, we understand your perspective," he said, "but you have to understand, your neighbor felt uncomfortable. They didn't expect this kind of gesture, and it came out of nowhere." Maria's mind was spinning. A gesture of kindness, out of nowhere. She had lived next to Mr. Thompson for years. They had shared brief greetings, but never really communicated. She had tried to make a friendly move, hoping it might bridge the gap, but now it seemed like her simple act had made things worse. How could a small box of cookies, with no hidden intentions, make someone feel uncomfortable? "I didn't mean to surprise him in a bad way," Mariah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I could do something kind, it might change how we interact. I didn't expect it to cause any trouble." The second officer finally spoke up, his expression hard to read. "We understand that, ma'am, but the fact is, your neighbor felt threatened. They felt your actions were too forward, and that's why they called us." Threatened? Maria's mind reeled at the word. She was being accused of threatening her neighbor with a box of cookies. She couldn't understand how something so simple could be perceived that way. She tried to stay calm, but her emotions were starting to bubble up. She had tried to be kind, to break the barrier between them, and yet here she was, defending herself for doing something good. "I didn't want to upset him," Mariah continued, her voice shaking now. I just thought. I thought he might appreciate it. A neighborly thing, you know. But now I can see that I must have been wrong. The officers exchanged glances, and Mariah could tell they were still unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't something they usually dealt with, someone being accused of harassment over a harmless act of kindness. She could see that they were caught in a difficult position, trying to do their duty while also trying to make sense of the situation. There was another long pause before the first officer spoke again. Look, we're not here to make things worse. We just want to clear things up. We don't want to escalate this any further. He gave Mariah a sympathetic look, as though he recognized how absurd this whole situation had become. If you want, we can speak to your neighbor and try to resolve it directly. Mariah nodded, relief flooding through her. Finally, someone was offering to take action to fix this. But even as the relief settled in, she couldn't shake the feeling of hurt. She had always believed in kindness, in making the world a better place with small gestures. Now she was being made to feel like she had done something wrong just for trying to connect with someone who had never given her a chance. I don't want any trouble, Mariah said, her voice more firm now, even though her heart still ached. I just want to move on. I didn't mean to cause any problems. The officers nodded, and after a few more moments of conversation, they assured her that they would speak to Mr. Thompson and see if they could clear up the misunderstanding. As they left, Mariah stood in the doorway, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. There was relief that the situation wouldn't escalate further, but there was also a lingering sadness. The world felt a little more complicated than it had been before, and she wasn't sure if this act of kindness would ever be understood the way she had hoped. As the police car drove away, Mariah closed the door behind her and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. She had done what she thought was right, but sometimes even the best intentions could lead to unexpected consequences. She just hoped that one day Mr. Thompson would realize that she wasn't trying to force her way into his life. She was simply trying to show that kindness could make a difference, even when it felt like the world was against it. The days following the visit from the police were long and filled with uncertainty. Mariah couldn't stop thinking about the events that had unfolded. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, wondering if there was something more she could have done or said to prevent the misunderstanding. She had hoped that a small act of kindness would break the wall between her and Mr. Thompson, but now she wasn't sure if things could ever be the same. Each time she stepped outside, her eyes would drift to Mr. Thompson's house. She would glance over at his porch, wondering if he was home or if he would come out to face her, but there was no sign of him. He hadn't made any attempt to speak with her, and that made her feel even more uneasy. It felt like there was an invisible wall between them, stronger than ever before. The tension in the air was palpable. Mariah had expected the situation to blow over quickly, but it seemed to only grow more complicated with time. She had always valued peace, and she had tried to approach the situation with kindness, but now the uncertainty was eating at her. Every time the doorbell rang, her heart would race, thinking it might be another unexpected confrontation. Would the police come back? Would Mr. Thompson speak to her directly? One afternoon, as Maria was tending to her garden, she saw a figure at the end of the street. It was Mr. Thompson. He was standing by his mailbox, staring down at something in his hands. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Mariah felt a jolt in her chest. But as quickly as the connection was made, he looked away, his face hardening again. He didn't wave or acknowledge her, and he didn't come over to talk. He simply turned and walked back to his house, leaving Mariah standing there, feeling a mix of disappointment and confusion. It was clear that Mr. Thompson wasn't interested in speaking to her, but Mariah couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Did he truly believe that she had meant him harm? Had he misinterpreted her intentions so badly that there was no coming back from this? That evening, Mariah sat by her kitchen window, staring out at the quiet street. She watched the light fade from the sky, and a sense of loneliness settled over her. She had tried to be kind, to do something good, But it seemed like no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't change the way people saw her. Even with all her efforts, the world didn't always respond with understanding. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she got up to answer it. She wasn't sure if it would be the police again, or maybe even Mr. Thompson. But when she opened the door, she was surprised to find a woman standing there, someone she hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, her voice soft. "I live a few houses down from you. I heard what happened with Mr. Thompson, and I wanted to let you know that I don't think you did anything wrong." Maria blinked in surprise. "Oh," she said, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, but I don't really know what else to say. I never intended to cause any trouble." The woman smiled kindly. "I can tell you didn't. I just wanted you to know that not everyone feels the same way Mr. Thompson does. I don't know what's going on with him, but it's clear that you were just trying to be kind." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was strange to feel reassured by a stranger's words, but something about hearing that she hadn't done anything wrong made her feel lighter. She realized that sometimes people don't always understand good intentions, and that was okay. She couldn't control how others reacted, but she could control her own actions. The woman and Maria spoke for a few more minutes, and as they parted ways, Maria couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope. Maybe the world wasn't as harsh as it seemed. Maybe, just maybe, there were people out there who saw things differently. People who understood that kindness wasn't a threat, but a bridge. As Maria returned to her home, she knew that the road ahead might still be difficult. The situation with Mr. Thompson hadn't been resolved, and there was still a lot of uncertainty. But she also knew that she couldn't let this one experience define her. She had done what she believed was right, and no matter what, she would continue to try to bring kindness into the world, even if others didn't always see it the way she did. Days passed, and Maria found herself sinking deeper into her thoughts. The situation with Mr. Thompson had left her with more questions than answers. Every time she saw him, or even thought about him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was hard for her to understand how a simple act of kindness could be twisted so much. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of life Mr. Thompson had lived to make him so closed off, so unwilling to accept something as harmless as a batch of cookies. One evening, as Maria sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and trying to distract herself from the uncomfortable situation, she began to think about her own life. She had always been the kind of person who believed in second chances, in the idea that people could change if given the opportunity. She had seen it happen before in her own community, how small acts of kindness could slowly chip away at walls that people built around themselves. But this time, it felt different. Mr. Thompson had built up such a strong wall that even her most thoughtful gestures didn't seem to make a dent. It was hard not to feel discouraged. Maria had always tried to approach the world with an open heart. She had always believed that kindness could heal, that understanding could bridge gaps between people. But now, in the face of Mr. Thompson's reaction, she wasn't so sure anymore. The world felt like it was filled with invisible walls, walls built out of fear, suspicion, and misunderstanding. No matter how hard she tried to reach out, it seemed like some people would never let their guard down. As she thought about it, Maria realized that part of her pain wasn't just about the misunderstanding with Mr. Thompson. It was about the broader picture. How many times had she tried to connect with people, only to be met with resistance? How many times had she faced prejudice, simply because of who she was? She wasn't naive. She knew that there were many people in the world who held prejudices, people who couldn't see beyond their own biases. But it didn't make it any easier to bear. And yet, as the days went on, Maria found that she couldn't give up on her belief that kindness mattered. It was the foundation of everything she had worked for in her life. If she stopped believing in kindness now, what would be left? She couldn't let one person's coldness, one misunderstanding, shatter everything she stood for. The world needed more people willing to take risks for the sake of compassion. And even if it didn't always lead to the results she hoped for, she couldn't stop trying. The experience with Mr. Thompson had shown her something important, though. Sometimes, no matter how much you want to make a connection, people aren't ready to receive it. There were times when a simple act of kindness wasn't enough to break through years of hurt or fear. That was a painful lesson for her, but it was also an eye-opening one. It made her realize that change couldn't always be forced. It had to come from within. And sometimes, it took time. Still, Maria wasn't ready to give up on her community. She continued to live her life with the same open heart, offering small acts of kindness wherever she could. She spent more time with her other neighbors, building relationships that felt more genuine, more open. She didn't expect everything to be perfect, but she knew that the more love and kindness she put into the world, the more it would come back to her. And who knows, maybe one day Mr. Thompson would see things differently. Maybe after some time, he would understand that she hadn't been trying to invade his space, but simply trying to offer a little warmth to a neighbor who might have been lonely or misunderstood himself. It was possible, even if it didn't seem likely right now. Maria didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let one person's reaction define her. She would keep moving forward, no matter how difficult it was. Because in the end, she believed that kindness was always worth it, even if it didn't always bring the results she hoped for. The following week felt quieter, almost too quiet for Maria. After the police had left and the conversation with her neighbor had gone nowhere, she had hoped that things would return to normal. But the truth was, everything felt a little off. It wasn't just about the cookies anymore. It wasn't even just about Mr. Thompson. It was about the feeling that something in the air had shifted, and now she wasn't sure where she stood. Her days were filled with routine, working, taking care of her house, chatting with a few of the other neighbors who were always warm and kind. But there was a nagging thought in the back of her mind, one she couldn't shake. What if Mr. Thompson never understood? What if he never saw that she was only trying to be friendly? She had done her part. She had offered an olive branch, and now it seemed like the ball was in his court. But what if he didn't even want to catch it? It was a thought that made her uneasy. She had always believed in the power of kindness, and her heart had always told her that small gestures could change the world. But now, standing in her own front yard one evening, she wasn't so sure. She had reached out to someone who had rejected her, and that rejection stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. She hadn't expected Mr. Thompson to suddenly become her best friend, but she had hoped for at least a bit of understanding, a sign that the world could be different than the hurtful patterns she had seen so many times before. As she stood there, looking out at the houses around her, Maria realized that she was holding on to something that might never happen. She had tried her best to reach out to Mr. Thompson, but it was possible that he wasn't ready to receive her kindness. It wasn't just him. It was the truth about people sometimes. Some people, no matter how much you try, may never let their walls down. And as painful as that was to accept, it was something she couldn't change. But that didn't mean she was going to stop trying. One afternoon, as Maria was returning from the grocery store, she noticed a small, unexpected sight. Mr. Thompson was outside, this time not tending to his garden, but standing by his porch, looking out at the street. She didn't know if he had seen her, but something about the way he was standing, almost as if he was waiting for something, caught her attention. It felt like a moment of pause, a brief shift in the otherwise quiet tension that had surrounded their relationship. Maria stopped for a moment, unsure of what to do. She could walk inside and pretend like nothing had changed, but part of her felt like she couldn't leave this moment hanging. She had tried to do the right thing, and now it seemed like he might be open to something. She hesitated for only a moment before walking over to him, the bag of groceries now forgotten in her hand. She felt her heart race as she approached him, the nerves and uncertainty creeping back, but she couldn't let the moment pass without at least trying to speak. "Mr. Thompson," Maria called out, her voice steady but soft. He turned to look at her, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, not resistance, but maybe curiosity, or even a hint of recognition. He didn't speak right away, but he didn't turn away either. That was something. Maria smiled gently, trying to keep the conversation light. I know things have been a bit strange lately, and I just wanted to check in. I didn't mean to cause any trouble with the cookies. I really just wanted to be a good neighbor. There was a pause, and then, to her surprise, he nodded slightly. I didn't understand at first, he admitted, but I can see that you meant well. It just took me off guard. Maria felt a little weight lift off her shoulders. He had acknowledged her gesture, even if it had taken some time for him to come around. She could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation yet, but it was a start. I understand, she replied. I just want to make sure we're on good terms, you know. For the first time in a long time, Mr. Thompson seemed to relax just a little. We're fine, he said, almost reluctantly. I guess I'm not used to people reaching out like that, but I appreciate it. Maria smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment, even if it was small. Maybe things wouldn't be perfect. Maybe Mr. Thompson wouldn't become a close friend overnight. But she had taken a step, and so had he. That was more than she could have asked for. As she walked back to her house, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done what she could. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply try. You can't control how others react, but you can choose to be kind, even in the face of uncertainty. And in the end, that was all that mattered. After that brief conversation with Mr. Thompson, Maria felt a quiet sense of hope stirring inside her. The tension that had weighed so heavily on her shoulders in the past few days had begun to lift, even if only slightly. The air felt lighter as she went about her daily tasks. It was clear that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a little more at peace. The next few days came and went with a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Maria noticed Mr. Thompson outside again, though he didn't say much. He didn't go out of his way to avoid her, and she saw him nod in her direction when they crossed paths. It wasn't much, but it was progress. For Maria, this small change was enough. She had learned not to expect perfection from others, especially when it came to relationships that were still in their early stages. But she couldn't deny that, after all the confusion, a connection, however small, had started to form. It wasn't just about Mr. Thompson anymore. The experience had opened her eyes to something bigger, the power of perseverance. Maria had reached out to someone who at first had no interest in her kindness, and while the result hadn't been immediate or easy, she had planted a seed. It reminded her that not everything in life could be solved with one grand gesture. Sometimes, things took time, and it was okay if progress came slowly. The most important thing was to keep going, to continue doing what was right, even when the results weren't obvious. Maria realized that kindness was a two-way street. While she had made the effort, it was up to Mr. Thompson to accept or reject it. But in the process, she had learned something about herself. She had learned to be patient with others, and even more importantly, she had learned to be patient with herself. She wasn't perfect, and neither was anyone else. But that didn't mean she should stop trying to do good in the world. As time went on, the awkwardness between her and Mr. Thompson faded. It didn't disappear completely, but it became less noticeable. Maria began to appreciate the simple exchanges they had, the brief nods in passing, the occasional wave. They weren't friends, not yet, but there was an unspoken understanding that things were slowly improving. Maybe, someday, they would have a real conversation, one that wasn't colored by misunderstandings or awkwardness. But for now, she was content to let things unfold at their own pace. One afternoon, Maria stood on her porch, looking out at the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over everything. She felt a quiet satisfaction in the small victories that had come from this experience. It wasn't just about making peace with Mr. Thompson anymore. It was about learning the value of persistence, of not giving up on people even when it seemed hard. The neighborhood was peaceful, and as Maria thought about how far she had come, She realized that sometimes it was the smallest moments that mattered the most. A gesture, a conversation, a step forward, even if it was just a tiny one, could change everything. She didn't know what the future held with Mr. Thompson, but she had done her part, and that was enough. As she turned to go back inside, she felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. The world wasn't always kind or fair, but that didn't mean she had to stop being kind. She would continue to be the person she had always been, someone who believed in making the world a better place, one small act at a time. No matter how difficult things got, no matter how many times she was misunderstood, she would keep trying. Because in the end, she knew that kindness was always worth it.